Shalom and welcome everyone to the ICEJ webinar series. I'm David Parsons, one of the vice presidents here at the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem, and our senior spokesman coming to you from our headquarters in the Israeli capital. We're doubling down this week with two webinars. Yesterday, we talked about the IDF progress in Gaza with IDF spokesman Jonathan Conricus and Major Elliot Chadoff. You can find that on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page. Go back, lots of good information material on there on how well Israel is going about its plan for dismantling Hamas in Gaza. Today, we're going to deal with the legal issues surrounding this conflict and all the accusations and charges being leveled at Israel about committing war crimes, genocide, and all of that in Gaza. And our special guest is Professor Avi Bell. Good to see you, Avi.
Good to see you as well. Thank you for having me.
Okay, coming to us from Washington right now. But Avi is Professor Bell is a member of the faculty of Law at Bar-Ilan University and University of San Diego School of Law. He's previously taught at Fordham and the University of Connecticut. He has degrees from the University of Chicago and Harvard. He also serves as a senior fellow with the Kohelet Policy Forum. And they were involved in some of the ideas for legal reforms over the past year here in Israel. And Professor Bell is a legal scholar in international law, the laws of war, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. We've turned to him many times before at ICEJ events and on our webinars to try and understand all the legal international law issues surrounding all these wars that get thrust upon Israel time after time, and all these charges, endless charges, genocide, war crimes. Avi, help us right now in this hour, because the accusations are flying everywhere. We hear it from not only the squad in Washington, but Queen Rania in Jordan and the BBC, of course. One article, I'll quote it, depriving civilians of water, food, and electricity is a violation of international law, the UN says. So is attacking hospitals, even if Israel suspects Hamas fighters are hiding there. These are some of the accusations being lobbed at Israel right now. How do you answer all of these charges that Israel is committing war crimes in Gaza?
Well, yeah, what I'm going to do, actually, I think that it's easier to understand all these things if I give you a very short background. So
that's great.
Okay, so the background that you have to understand is that almost all of the laws of war that we have today are based on a certain moral theory. It's a moral theory of Thomas Aquinas. There's a passage in one of his books in which he discusses the moral puzzle of an action that has double effect. It has a good effect and a bad effect that we know about in advance. And the question is whether you can do this action that's going to cause good and bad, And the way Aquinas frames it, he says it's moral to do this thing that will cause both good and bad if you intend the good and if the good outweighs the bad. Right. So, and this is, when you're talking about war, it's an obvious way to frame things because war involves death and destruction. And when you're trying to figure out what are the right actions to take in carrying out war, you're trying to figure out how it is that one can morally use deadly force and carry out destruction when on the one hand, one knows that one's going to be harming civilians. We're going to be harming people who we don't want to harm. On the other hand, there's a pressing need to use deadly force in order to save ourselves, to save our civilians, to save people from the terrorists like Hamas who are doing acts that are inhuman, and unless they're forcibly stopped, they will continue doing so. So that's the framework, and the basic rules in the laws of war are like those set out by Aquinas, which is you may use deadly force and destruction against the enemy, against combatants on the other side, against objects that serve the enemy, even though you know for certain there's going to be a bad effect of collaterally harming civilians. Collateral damage is one of these horrible words that we use, but it's a real legal term, right? That is, we know we're going to harm civilians anyway. But as long as the harm to civilians is not expected to be exaggerated, it's something that the laws of war sanction. And this is the basic picture that you have in the fighting in Gaza, is that you have one side, the side of Hamas terrorists, that don't particularly care about this moral framework. In fact, they oppose it. The aim of their force is to strike at Israeli civilians, to strike at Jews. Their aim is frankly genocidal. They want to destroy the Jewish people in the land of Israel, and they violate the laws of war in almost every imaginable way. They strike at civilians as such. They abuse humanitarian symbols, right? They use ambulances to ferry fighters around. They have their headquarters in hospitals. They use human shields all the time and openly so. They hold hostages. They carry out these depraved acts that, like, they raped, mutilated, tortured the people that they assaulted in October 7th, parents in front of children, children in front of parents. It just, the horrors are unspeakable. And on the other side, you have a fighting force that is quite scrupulous about following the rules. And that means it aims its force at legitimate targets, at Hamas, where Hamas is, at the terrorists themselves, at people who are participating in conflict on the Hamas side, and at those objects that Hamas uses in its conflict, which, by the way, include those ambulances and hospitals and et cetera, that Hamas is misusing. Hamas there is breaking the law. Israel is not. Now, it's an unfortunate side effect of this. We know that the law-abiding side is going to end up having collateral damage. That is one of the things that happens when you have a war between a law-abiding force on the other one side and a terrorist force that uses human shields on the other side. Some of those shields are going to get hurt. Some of those shields are going to get killed, and that's really awful. That said, it's a bad result that is expected with the good result, and we have a legal framework for dealing with it. It's not very satisfying, but it's the best we can do. And the alternative of allowing Hamas to continue carrying out its depravity is just not an acceptable one. This is a case where it's clear what has to be done, even though we know there's going to be some unfortunate consequences.
Yes. So Israel, they cut off their share of the power, the electric, to Gaza. For a little while, they cut off Israel's share of the water that goes in. There were a couple of days where they didn't allow food or aid, medicine through the Erez crossing, but all of this is going in again. At least the water pipes have been open in central and southern Gaza. The food, the aid, the medicines are going in through Erez, but you're not required to give these things to an enemy. What does the international law say about those particular items?
Yeah, so you're old enough to remember this. Back in the first Gulf War, when they asked Colin Powell what his strategy was for fighting the Iraqi army, and he said it's real simple:
You cut it
cut it
off,
off.
then you kill it.
Exactly, you cut it off and you kill it. And cutting off supply lines to the enemy is one of the most basic things one does in war. Sieges are lawful means of carrying out a war. No party in a war has any duty to supply anything to the other side. So Israel's under no legal obligation to supply electricity or water or food or clothing or medicine, anything. And it's pretty basic that Israel has to, if it wants to bring the war to a rapid and successful conclusion, it has to cut off supply lines to Hamas. Now, that said, there's a set of laws in wartime about specifically humanitarian supplies to civilians. Mm-hmm. And that's it's a limited list, but it's basically food and medicine. Right? And the rule is that if you're involved in a war, every side, and it doesn't make a difference if you're the attacker, the defender, all sides have to allow third parties to bring in humanitarian supplies unless there's a chance that it's going to be taken away by the enemy, it's going to be diverted, or there are a couple of other exceptions. But in this case, in the case of fighting in Gaza, it's not simply that we know that humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip ends up being diverted. We know for certain it's going to be diverted. Right? It's not that there's a chance. Hamas completely controls all the delivery mechanisms in the Gaza Strip, and it's been using them for more than a decade in order to steal the food, take over the hospitals, take over the medicines. Right now, as the fighting goes on, we know that Hamas has stored water and food and medicine and fuel enough for several months of fighting, and it's holding it back from the civilians in Gaza. We had an incident a couple of days ago where there's a raid on a UN warehouse of humanitarian supplies, where it's fairly clear that some of the people raiding it were Hamas people themselves. There is absolute certainty that anything that goes in is going to be taken by Hamas. And that creates a situation where Israel ought not to. In fact, I would say, according to the law, it's forbidden for any state in the world to send in supplies when it knows that it's going to provide indirect support to the terrorist organization Hamas. That's contrary to UN Security Council Resolution 1373. So what is it that you can do to rescue civilians in a situation like that? And it's obvious that until you can get Hamas out of power in Gaza, the only realistic thing to do is to get the civilians, to get the human shields out of harm's way. And instead of trying to figure out how to get supplies into Hamas-controlled Gaza, what we ought to be doing is thinking about how do we get civilians out of Gaza so they're outside of harm's way. It seems to me that as long as Hamas is in power, that's the only realistic way to ensure that civilians are not harmed.
Yeah, I know in recent the past decade or two, the Russian military doctrine, we saw it in Aleppo, other places in the Syrian civil war. We've seen it in Ukraine. They just bomb cities to rubble. There's no warning or whatever. And there were times of humanitarian corridors, say in Mariupol, but I know Russia has started lobbing charges against Israel, but Israel seems to go out of its way more than any other military, the IDF in the world, in trying to get civilians out of the way with all the warnings, all the robocalls, all the direct calls, and is that going to help shield Israel from some of the charges that might be brought against it?
Well, Israel is doing this because it's trying to ensure that civilians don't get harmed. It's not doing this with the belief that all of a sudden there's going to be a fair accounting in the world of Israel's actions, because we all know from experience that there are two entirely different standards that are used out there. There's the one that's used for everybody else in the world, and there's the one that's applied to Israel, the one that's applied to the Jewish state. And there's actually a very good example just in the last few weeks. About a week and a half ago, I think it was, the ICC prosecutor, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, came to visit the border between the Gaza Strip and Egypt.
Karim
And
Khan, a British
Karim Khan,
Muslim. Seems like a
yes.
pretty decent guy, but he was anxious to get in through Erez. I don't know if Israel let him. I mean, through the
He
Rafah border.
he was not allowed in by anyone. So
Okay.
right, the Rafah border is between Egypt and the Gaza Strip. It's
Mm-hmm.
controlled by Hamas on one side and by the Egyptian government on the other, and they didn't allow him to be admitted. Israel's not allowed him into its territory. But what I wanted to point out about Karim Khan, he was asked. He gave a press conference in Cairo afterwards, in which he was discussing illegality. And he did mention, and this is actually unusual for an international figure, he did acknowledge that there's serious charges against the Hamas terrorists, that
Mm-hmm.
of hostage taking, of carrying out atrocities during their attack. Now, he was very careful when he mentioned them. He said alleged, 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 alleged. He said, it has to be proved, it has to be proved, it has to be proved. Now, that's fair enough. He's a prosecutor for a court. You have to meet your burden of proof. On the other hand, when he was talking about Israel, he dropped all that stuff about alleged and proved, and he said Israel has to allow humanitarian supplies. Israel's not allowing some humanitarian, and then he went past that, and he said Israel's targeting decisions. Israel is striking civilians. Now, Israel has to prove that every one of its targets is a valid target. Now,
That's a
Israel
double
doesn't have
standard.
yeah, Israel doesn't have to prove that. No defendant has to prove their innocence. It's for the prosecutor to prove guilt. And so what he's setting up is a standard, and this is apparently the standard they use in the International Criminal Court. Everybody in the world, except for Israelis, except for Jews, everyone in the world is presumed innocent, and the prosecutor has to prove guilt. When it comes to Israel and the Jews, they have to prove their innocence. And the ICC can just sit back and pronounce everybody guilty on the Israeli side without having to make any showing of proof. Now, that's the very definition of a double standard. And that is the problem. The problem here is not Israeli conduct. The problem here is the absorption over years of these double standards by which Israel is always presumed guilty.
Yeah, I mean, he rushed here because they already have a standing investigation dating back to the rocket war in 2014, and there was an African lady, the prosecutor for the ICC back then, who made sure the investigation started the day after the abduction of three Jewish yeshiva students down in the Gush Etzion block, and so that you don't have the cause of the whole conflict. Quite diabolic of her to do that. But that's already, I guess, this conflict is just going to be added to that. Do you think it's going to get serious attention by him, given the war crimes in Ukraine and other problems?
The International Criminal Court has been working on this since before even 2014, and before even Fatou Bensouda, she was the former prosecutor. back in the days of Ocampo, the prior
Mm-hmm.
prosecutor, the ICC team was already working together with the PLO to try to figure out a basis for um, jurisdiction and charges against Israelis, and which is it's a difficult matter because the court doesn't have jurisdiction unless the state accepts its jurisdiction. Israel's not accepted the ICC, and
Mm-hmm.
so it doesn't really have jurisdiction. But nonetheless, they've been coming up with these theories now for more than a decade by which the
Mm-hmm.
court could get hold of prosecuting Israelis.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just been running straight through. It doesn't the ICC doesn't investigate by individual acts. It investigates by what it calls situations. And situations are basically something happening in a place over a long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
So, what they're investigating is what they call the situation in Palestine since 2015. That's what they're in, right. That's the name of their investigation. And the aim of their investigation, it's been clear from the very beginning, is to bring charges against Israelis. There's no indication of any serious effort to charge Palestinian criminals.
Mm-hmm.
And I would be very surprised if even the latest atrocities by Hamas result in anybody being put on trial, any Palestinian being put on trial in the court. What I can guarantee you, and this is very unfortunate, but there will be charges against Israelis, and I don't know what they will relate to. But that's the whole purpose of this investigation. The whole purpose of the investigation is to cook up something that will justify charges against Israelis and presumably of non-crimes, but I don't believe that they have any expectation of a conviction. The idea is simply to have charges against Israel. That's the purpose of the investigation, and that's where it will get.
Yeah, I remember when Kareem Khan first came in a year or so ago, uh, that he made some comment that he was most interested in this question of whether the Israeli settlement activity is a war crime. Uh, but look, if we get into some of the incidents, Israel says it struck an ambulance because it had Hamas fighters in it, and you're not immune if you're in an ambulance if you're a combatant.
Yeah, well, let's put this the other way. If you are a combatant and you are using an ambulance in order to try to shield yourself, you are committing a crime. The Hamas fighters in that ambulance are committing a war crime that, if you believe that the ICC has jurisdiction over the situation, it has jurisdiction over that crime. And the crime is abusing humanitarian symbols, right? It's trying to use the very humanitarian protections of the law to shield yourself from military action. So Hamas there is committing a crime. On the other hand, once you do this, once you make an ambulance a shield, um, as a legal matter, it's no longer an ambulance. It's a legitimate military target.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that means it can be targeted along with anything else. And so it's the same thing, with the ambulances, or there's going to be at some point a confrontation about Shifa Hospital. Shifa Hospital is a hospital where Hamas, for more than a decade, has located its command and control center in the basement. And everyone knows this. It's discussed you can see reports in the Washington Post going back a decade. Amnesty International actually had a report in 2014 about how Hamas used empty outpatient clinics in Shifa Hospital as torture chambers for domestic opponents. Right? There's no doubt whatsoever that Shifa is used by Hamas as military headquarters and to carry out various kinds of war crimes at the same time as patients are being treated there. Right? The patients are being used as human shields
Mm-hmm.
by Hamas. Now, it's a moral challenge. How do we get the patients out of there so that we can attack Hamas with minimal collateral damage? But that said, according to the laws of war, that hospital is not immune from attack. that hospital is a legitimate military target because it is a military headquarters of Hamas. And the challenge for Israel is simply how to do this with the minimum collateral damage to rescue as many of the human shields as possible from Hamas.
I think brings up this whole issue of proportionality, the charges that Israel has a disproportionate response. I think even some defenders of Israel, when they talk about this, they don't quite understand it. Can you run us through this? Say you've got a guy with a gun in one of the rooms shooting out a window of the hospital at Israeli forces. How do you go through the issue of proportionality to take him out?
So, okay, so proportionality, this comes from what I mentioned at the very beginning. This comes from Aquinas's moral theory, right? And what the rule of proportionality is in the laws of war is it says when you are attacking something legitimate,
A legitimate military target.
a fighter in the window of a hospital,
Yeah.
right? When you're attacking a legitimate military target, you can do so even though you know for certain that innocence will be harmed, as long as the harm to innocence is not clearly exaggerated. It's not excessive in
Mm-hmm.
relation to the military necessity. And the military necessity is taking out the target. The military necessity is defeating the enemy. That's the way the laws of war work. So if Israel looks at a fighter shooting out of a hospital window, can it return fire towards the Hamas terrorist in the window? And the answer is obviously yes. Israel can do so up to the point where the collateral damage is expected to be excessive. Now, what's excessive? It doesn't mean um, uh, um, excessive according to some number scale because we don't have such a thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's what would a reasonable military commander in a similar situation consider to be excessive, and you can tell the answer to that by looking at what do military commanders in law-abiding armies, like let's say U.S. Forces, what would they do in similar situations? Now, what I can tell you is that U.S. forces operating, let's say, in Iraq against ISIS, or in Afghanistan against Al Qaeda and the Taliban, would have civilians would end up with collateral civilian damage that was many multiples of the number of terrorists that they killed. The physical destruction carried out by U.S. forces was enormous, and
Mm-hmm.
that's because that's the way it has to be when you're fighting against someone like Al Qaeda or ISIS or Hamas that deliberately uses human shields. That is,
They don't play fair.
it's worse than they don't play fair. What they are the bank robber that is hiding themselves behind the hostage that they just
Mm-hmm.
took. They want the hostages to be harmed. They want, right, that the whole point is to create human misery in
Mm-hmm.
order to profit from it. And
Mm-hmm.
so it creates a horrible situation. But the dilemma, the answer to the dilemma is clear to any reasonable military commander, which is when they take hold of the hospital and they are using the patients as human shields, you cannot give them immunity. If you do, you're just encouraging them to use more human shields and to create more human misery. You
Mm-hmm.
have to take them out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there have been quite a few studies that showed that the ratio of civilian to combatant deaths in Israel's actions against, especially in Hamas and combatants in Gaza, is the ratio of civilian deaths is far lower than, say, the British and Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think that's
Absolutely.
well documented. Yeah.
Yeah. In Israeli actions, it's roughly 1-to-1. And in U.S. and U.K. Fighting, it's far in excess of that. You know, it's the numbers are hard to count up because the terrorists don't give us accurate figures, but apparently it's something between 2 and 3 civilian deaths for every combatant death. And I don't say this criticizing U.S. and U.K. forces. I think that they're doing the best that they can. I actually think this is a criticism of Israeli forces. Israeli forces may be being excessively cautious, right?
Mm.
Israel is holding back fire in cases where other combating fighters won't, and the cost of that is Israeli soldiers die. Israeli soldiers are put in harm's way in order to save the human shields that are being used by Hamas. And it's not that I don't have compassion for the human shields. I most certainly do. But I think that Israel is entitled to use greater force to protect its soldiers.
Do you know of any solid data on Russian actions and the ratios there?
Asking this about Russia is a little bit silly because the Russians don't care. I
Okay.
wouldn't put the Russians in the same category as Hamas. They're not of that
Yeah.
level of depravity, but they don't particularly care about rules of proportionality, and so
Yeah.
they're not going to give us figures, and they don't particularly care about it.
Yeah, they've been put under investigation by the ICC as well, the International Criminal Court in The Hague, but I don't think they've signed on to that. What is it, the Rome Statute themselves, anyway? So
Right.
that's
They
what
they
you don't.
they have not. The basis for the ICC jurisdiction is a little bit sketchy, but nonetheless, the ICC has put out arrest warrants. It's put out a warrant for Putin,
Even
and this
Putin.
gets a yeah,
That's for
and
the
this
massacres around Kiev, Bucha, and other areas, I think.
yeah, and it's just that this gets us to another bit about the ICC. The fact is that the international legal system does not function, right?
Yeah.
So it's very nice that he puts out this arrest warrant, but we know that Putin will never see the inside of a courtroom.
Yeah.
It's more a propaganda effort than anything else, and in the case of Russia, they're really going after bad guys, so I don't mind the propaganda effort. In the case of Israel and Hamas, they're going after the good guys, and it's all that much worse that all they're doing is propaganda for the bad guys.
Okay. So, our hypothetical, the guy in the window shooting in a hospital, you can't bring down the whole hospital. You have to be proportional. And Israel is good at smaller munitions, hitting pinpoint targets than any other army.
Well, it's you don't let's be clear. What do you mean by proportionate, right? Can
Yeah.
you bring down the hospital? Maybe, and it depends on what else you think is
What else
there.
is there? Yeah.
Right. But in general, the idea is you don't want to cause exaggerated
Hmm.
collateral damage, right? So if you see the fighter in the window and that's all you see, and you have no reason to believe that behind it there's anything else, and you don't expect that the entire room behind him is full of patients that are stuck in this one room, then yeah, you shoot for the room. But it's always contextual, right? It's
Hmm.
always a question of who do you think is there? What's the nature of the target? And do you think it's going to be exaggerated in collateral damage? It may be that if you think that the hospital is empty, that in fact the best option is actually take down the whole hospital,
Hmm.
right? You can't say without knowing the context what is the right response to something like that. It's what when people say proportionality and they give you one or two facts and say, well, the result is clearly whatever, they're not understanding the rule. The rule of proportionality doesn't have anything to do with proportions. It has
Hmm.
to do with being cautious not to have excessive collateral damage.
Yeah, and a targeting decision like that, the Israeli military has a whole bank of JAG Corps officers who are helping weigh the balance there, like many other Western armies. So there's
Yeah,
someone
so
with a legal training to help make those decisions.
many of them are my students, right? So
Okay.
yeah, it's not an easy job. You're
Yeah.
going along. Some of them they're going along with the troops, and they're in the situation
Mm. All
and
right.
giving an answer.
All right, we've spent enough time trying to help people out there defend Israel, but let's talk about Hamas. I don't know if there's ever been such an in modern times since the Holocaust, perhaps such and maybe the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, the Darfur, or what happened in Rwanda, but so well documented. None of that is documented like what Hamas did on October 7th, and especially against the Jewish people. This is clear cases of war crimes and even genocide, ethnic cleansing by Hamas, by Palestinians, correct?
Yeah, this is the largest one-day toll of Jews murdered in an attack since the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's also it's one of the great atrocities of recent decades. And yeah, you're right. There, people do some depraved things in this world. The Khmer Rouge. You look at the genocide in Rwanda. People have done some really really awful things over the years. What's unusual about the Hamas attack is not simply that it was targeted at the Jews and this awful toll. It's also their pride in it. So they went around with cameras to record themselves engaging in the most depraved acts, and as a result, there are these films, and I have to say, I was very reluctant to watch them. I don't want to see this. Right? I don't think that you're the same person after you see this kind of human evil, but you can see this just awful things, the things that no human being should do. Eh, there's cases where the forensics find that you have the children tied up in one side of the kitchen and the parents tied up in the other side of the kitchen, and their eyes gouged out and limbs chopped off, and it's clear that they took their time in murdering these people and torturing them in front of one another, right? The Lord, the idea is to cause this human misery, that like that to play on the love people have for their parents and their children, their siblings, but it's much, you have these even worse things. I don't even know how to describe it. There's this film you can see where there's a Hamas guy shoots a farmer in the belly. The guy is clearly dying of his wounds, and the terrorist grabs a hoe to try to behead the dying farmer, and the hoe is unable to do it, and so he keeps striking again and again. It just the depravity behind this is enormous, and you're right, these are not just war crimes. They're crimes against humanity. They're crimes of genocide, and they're crimes of terrorism. Terrorism is an international crime as well. This is the most obvious set of crimes imaginable. It's just the problem is, again, as I said, we don't really have an international legal system, and so there isn't really an institution that's capable of dealing with this. And with all due respect for the ICC, even if it were to get past its double standards, even if it were to decide to actually prosecute the bad guys instead of the good guys, it's not clear how they could carry out a serious set of prosecutions against the Hamas criminals, because they would never be able to get their hands on them. Right?
Yeah.
They couldn't be brought into court. We will have, I presume, in Israel, some trials of those handful of people, those handful of Hamas terrorists that have fallen, were captured by Israel, but most of them will never face justice until they go meet their Lord.
Yeah, I know there's talk of like a open tribunal to show the world what happened. Do you support the revival of the death penalty in Israel for these sort of crimes? They haven't executed someone since Adolf Eichmann in what, 61 or something?
Yeah, I don't remember the date of Eichmann, but there are only a few statutes in Israel that permit for the death penalty.
There's already a move in the Knesset to revive the death penalty for
But
this.
it's not. I don't think it's necessary, because one of the statutes that permits the death penalty is the statute against genocide. People who commit genocide are liable for the death penalty, and I think
In
it's very
Israel.
clear.
In
Yeah,
Israel.
yeah,
Yeah.
in Israel,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
And therefore it can be done. It's a question of more of desire rather than a question of does the law permit it. Um, and I if there are people who deserve the death penalty, the Hamas terrorists who carried out this atrocity are absolutely them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
but I don't know. I don't know how this is going to work out. In a certain way, it seems just inadequate, right? To hold a trial for the junior terrorists that carried out
Yeah.
the atrocities, even if they get the death penalty, it doesn't really bring the full scope of the crime to
Justice. Yeah.
justice.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I've seen the footage, the 45 minutes or so that have a Israel government press office press card, and went and watched it. And I think there's actually stuff circulating out already on social media that's just as bad. And they actually go easy on us. They didn't show a lot of the mutilations of live people, the rapes and such. But for me, one of the hardest things to watch there was the glee of not only the terrorists, but people back in Gaza when they brought bodies and dumped them, and the absolute rejoicing over depravity and slaughter. It was very disturbing. And I think what I want you to touch on now is the United Nations itself, which is pressuring Israel, and all their organs are out there, every forum. This is, turned into a cemetery for children and all this stuff. But especially UNRWA, the refugee agency, has allowed Hamas for several decades now to indoctrinate and brainwash another generation and another generation to jihad, glorifying martyrdom. Is the UN itself complicit in what Gaza has become?
Absolutely, but let's understand that this is a question of moral complicity rather than legal complicity, and the
Hmm.
truth is we don't really have a legal framework for dealing with the problem that you have in Gaza. What you have in Gaza is it's not just that you have the terrorists themselves who bear legal responsibility for their crimes, but you also have a much larger population that supports the terrorists. That when they have the opportunity to vote, which is quite rare,
Hmm.
but when they have had it, they voted for Hamas, right? The most popular party in the
Hey, it's a
Gaza Strip.
welfare society. Isn't that what they always said?
Yeah, not exactly, right? That's
Yeah.
like describing the Nazi party as as a social union, right?
Yes.
No, but it's not like people in the Gaza Strip don't know what Hamas is, right? And so um, you have a very large society which believes in accepts these depraved values. Um, the law doesn't have a framework for this, right? There's no, the law does not have a framework for viewing how do you denazify a society, right? Or what do you do when people have adopted, where the masses have adopted this fundamental evil into their hearts, and we don't have a law that deals with this. And yeah, when you talk about the UN, what you're talking about is an organization that in so many different sub-institutions in so many different ways have encouraged this, have encouraged the poisoning of the hearts of Palestinians, indoctrinating them into this genocidal hatred, into this acceptance of depravity. You talk about UNRWA, you're right, the refugee agency for the Palestinians. There's a report that was put out, I think it was about 15 years ago, where the head said, look, yeah, it's true that our most of our employees are sympathetic, or at least we have a very large number of employees that are Hamas, and yeah, probably the labor unions in UNRWA are controlled by Hamas. But so what? That's not our problem. Now that to me, that itself is a deep moral failure. And when the UN agencies allow this to happen, yes, they are morally failing us, but we don't have a legal tool to deal with something like that.
Yeah, I find it outrageous that to this day the United Nations, none of its organs, the Security Council nor the General Assembly, has condemned what Hamas did on October 7th. To this day, they have no moral standing in my eyes and legitimacy anymore. You were a former colleague researcher at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Now, they released something over the past couple of weeks that says there is, in the 1948 convention, an international treaty, convention on the prevention of genocide, it says advocating religious holy war aimed at creating a regional Islamic entity encompassing the whole of the territory of Israel is a violation of the Convention on Preventing Genocide. So there may be something there, but UNRWA says, look, we have to accept the curriculum of the local authorities no matter where we are. UNRWA needs to get out of Gaza then.
Right.
They have a choice about this. They don't have to be there.
Let me make this a little sharper. Okay, in the Genocide Convention, and by the way, the Israeli law that adopts the Genocide Convention makes it a crime not just to commit genocide; it makes it a crime to incite to genocide.
Yes.
And there have been cases on this, right? On this, there is law, right? Because unfortunately, there was a genocide in Rwanda. There was a special international tribunal on Rwanda, and people were brought up on charges of, among other things, inciting to genocide. There are people who were convicted of the crime of inciting to genocide for simpler acts than what UNRWA does. Well, UNRWA teachers do, right? People would give speeches to mobs that have carried out killings, and they would just say, "You've done good work," right? And by saying you've done good work, that was convictable incitement to genocide. Now, if that's the way we're looking at it, there is a large part of the world that has incited to genocide. Mm-hmm. But it's not realistic. It's not realistic to put on trial all the many people who have praised Hamas acts of genocide. It just, and then we get to well beyond any realistic possibility of any legal process ever. So yes, it's true that in that sense, if we're talking about incitement to genocide, it goes well beyond UNRWA. I mean, you can watch the TV screens and you can see people who are telling Hamas good work for acts of genocide. And that is incitement to genocide, right? But
Al Jazeera would be guilty.
Yes, absolutely. I think that if you are sticking to the letter of the law, I think that Al Jazeera is an institution that incites to genocide. But it's not realistic. It's not realistic to put them on trial.
No, that's a shame. This is the battle we have when we stand up with Israel. Even Christians who are defending and standing with Israel, we're told we're complicit in the bloodshed going on in Gaza, the innocent civilians. We're going to stand with Israel and on just reasons and causes. Amen. Look, Avi, Professor Avi Bell, it's been an excellent presentation. We really thank you. I think our time is up for now, but thank you for joining us. All the best you've got a conference there. You're teaching in the days ahead. And we'll probably have to call on you again, unfortunately, on these very difficult and complex legal issues. But thank you for your time.
And thank you, and God bless you for all you do.
All right. That's our webinar for today on the charges of war crimes in Gaza. Remember, we had yesterday IDF progress in Gaza. We heard from IDF spokesman Jonathan Conricus and IDF Major Elliot Chadoff on how well Israel's war plan is going on. You can find today's program and yesterday's, today's on war crimes in Gaza, on the ICEJ's official YouTube page, YouTube channel, also on our Facebook page. They'll be there over the weekend. Please share it with your friends. And for those, everyone, we encourage you to stay tuned. At the top of the hour, we're going to start our daily global prayer gathering. Please join us there to pray about all these things. Thank you, and God bless you from Jerusalem.
Thank you for joining us for this informative webinar. Be sure to subscribe to our social media channels or visit our website at icej.org for upcoming webinars and more ICEJ exclusive content.